Hello everyone and welcome back to .NET Core Central. Today I'm going to discuss about one of the very important topic when it comes to distributed programming. So when we are building distributed system and microservices, in most of the case what happens is one service, which is a single responsibility service, talks to bunch of other services which in turns are single responsibility. So they do one and only one thing and do it well. Now in this kind of scenario, what happens is your services are distributed across the network, and sometimes we might be using external services also, like Google service or Facebook service and things of that nature. And when you are dealing with services from different sources and different network issues are bound to happen, which means the services are bound to timeout, they're bound to have issues, and you will have HTTP exception. But the question is, how do we deal with this exception, right? Because sometimes some of these exception can self-heal, which means if you try a couple of times it might just work. In other cases they might just continue to fail, right? So usually when we deal with this kind of system, we have to build in logic for retries and things like circuit breaker in our application. Retries essentially, you continuously try 2 or 3 times until it works, and then you just give up and handle the exception and manage it so that your application is not broken and you send back an empty result or some sort of half-baked result back to the client based on your requirement. The circuit breaker, on the other hand, is if the same situation keeps on happening again and again, you just don't want to call the external service anymore because it is down. And instead of trying every 5 or 6 seconds, you basically take a break for, let's say, 30 seconds or 5 minutes or 10 minutes until you make the call again. So essentially with circuit breaker, what happens is that if the web service call, you try it 2 or 3 times, basically you retry, but even after retry it doesn't work, the circuit essentially trips. And then it sleeps for a certain configured amount of time. So that might be 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes, depending on what you want to configure. And after that timeout, it essentially goes into, or after the sleep time, it goes into a semi-open state where what it tries to do is it tries to call and see if it is still failing. If it's still failing, it just does a sliding. It keeps the circuit basically broken at that point in time. But if it succeeded, it will remove the circuit and open it so that the next call onwards will start going back to the active service. To show that, I'm going to have a couple of videos. I think if I try to do it in one video, I'm not going to do the justice. So in the first video, I'm just going to show how we can use retries. Now, initially, I will write a service which will just throw exception. That's all. And then I'll go and create another service which will implement the retry manually. And then I'm going to use .NET Core or .NET NuGet package called Poly, which helps doing the retries and circuit breakers and everything out of box. So I'm going to show how easy it is to configure Poly for retries. So that's what we will do today. And in the next video, I'm going to cover circuit breaker and some other features of Poly. So far, using Poly, I find it extremely helpful, especially when you have to deal with circuit breaker, retries, and all these things which are essentially boilerplate code, and you don't want to rewrite everywhere. And Poly does an awesome job of doing all those. So let me first start writing ASP.NET Core Web API, which will essentially just throw an exception. That's all it's going to do. It's never going to succeed. So I'm going to name it as error API. That's all it is. And then I'm going to create just a empty API. I don't need to configure HTTPS right now. Just maybe not Docker right now. I'll just create a simple API. Okay, and in the API, in the value controller, I'm going to go into get, and I'm just going to throw an exception. So essentially, every time the service is called, the API/values, it's just going to throw an error. That's all it's going to do. So I'm going to quickly run and see the response. And then I'm going to build the client API, which is going to, in the first attempt, I'm just going to create a for loop and implement the retry there. And then I'm going to just configure Poly and work with Poly. And we can see it's coming in the error block. Just going to continue. And then I'm getting the exception, which is expected. So I'm going to stop this guy. And I'm just going to, instead of debug, I'm just going to start without debugging so that it's running in the background. And so this is up and running. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, which is also going to be web API. And there I'm going to create the calling application. I'm going to name it as poly.demo. And I'm going to create a simple API. Okay, so I can see this is configured, and I have a value controller here similar to the other one. I'm going to go to startup. Now here what we can do is we can create a HTTP web client, or we can have iHTTP client, web client factory. And I'm going to go that route because that is going to help us later in the development. So I'm just going to go into startup. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the HTTP client. So services dot add HTTP client, and I'm going to have a name, and I'm going to call it as a error API client. And then I can set up the base URI here. So I can set base address equal to new of URI, and I can give the base address right here. And I'm going to give the base address here, which is I'm going to keep till here. That's the base address. So once I do that, once I configure this, what I can do is I can go back to my value controller, and now since I have configured the HTTP client, I can take in the constructor, I can take the HTTP client factory and then get the client that I configured with the name and use that. And now I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to put a try catch block because I know it's going to fail. So and here I'm going to say the HTTP client factory dot create client, and I'm going to give the same name that I've given defining this, which is error API client, and then I'm just going to call this client. And now this is going to throw an error, the get values. And then when the error comes, what I can do is I can put so it becomes little so here I can just do return, and so that I don't get the red squiggly. Okay. Can just okay. So for simplicity, I'm just going to do that. What is wrong? Just going to okay. So this should do it. This is obviously the simplest way, but not the best way. So let me just do this. So this is going to throw an exception, and then now what we want to do here is for 3 times we want to catch the exception and retry, and after the 3rd time we just want to give up. So this makes things really complex now. So now what we have to do is create a private method. I can just have a string array. And here I can have this code and what I can do is I can get rid of the okay, now let's keep it here like this way. So now what's going to happen is first time it'll come, it'll throw an error, so it'll go here, so it has to maintain some sort of count. It creates a equal to 1. It was first time it happened, and for just do this equal 0 count less than 3 count plus plus. So we wanted to retry 3 times, so it'll start from 1, 2 and then 3, so 3 times. What we'll do is we'll first do we'll sleep for, let's say, a second. Let's do this. Let's make count as 1 less than equal to 3. So then we can do, so first time we sleep for a second, second time for 2 seconds, third time 3 seconds, right? So we sleep, and then again we try to get values, and here we put a try catch block and just don't do anything essentially, right? It's not the best way to do it, but yeah, this does the job, and we can use this exception to, you know, put it into log and things like that. I'm not going there right now for this specific example. And so obviously for all practical purposes we can just delete it, but I want to keep it here so that we can debug through it and see what the exception is coming back. So we do that. So this will, what this will do is it will retry for 3 times after the first failure, and then if third time it fails, it'll just give up and return null and call it a day, right? In a real life program, you might be already making like 2 or 3 services calls. So you might have partial data. You might decide to send partial data back, or you might decide not to do anything. But anyway, for this one, let's do this. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint, start. Okay, so we get the HTTP client that we created, try to get the value. The response comes as 404 not found, or /API/value. Okay, I have to say let's run again. So we got an error 500 internal server error. That's what we expected, right? This will fail. This is failing because, you know, it's not able to serialize the data. So we'll start our sleeping for a second, retry, sleeping for 2 seconds this time, retry, and then sleeping for 3 seconds. Yeah, and then we are going to give up, and we're going to return null. So that's what we are going to do. So we retried 3 times, and after 3 times we gave up. Now everywhere we call an external service, we have to do this, and it's a little bit painful, you know. And this kind of code, I mean, you can create a separate function and have a action or func going into it so that you can call back into your actual function. That's way you can reuse the code, but why do it if Poly just helps us do that? So I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to use Poly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into manage NuGet package, and I'm going to search for Poly, and I'm going to install the microsoft.extension.http poly, because it automatically installs the Poly itself. The reason I'm going to do this because this gives an option of configuring the Poly in the startup here with an extension method without us doing a lot of things. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to install these. So let's install this. So it is not installing because I have a conflict with something. What is that? So not netcore to be greater than 2.1.1, less than 2.2. What do I have? So I have 2.1. Okay, so I'm going to install an older version of the Poly. So if I let's try 1 level, 2 level below. Let's try this. Yeah, this seems to work. Yeah, okay. So now what's going to happen is now we installed the extension for Poly, and now here we are going to go and add the Poly configuration for retries. So that's what we're going to do. So here now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add here add transient HTTP error policy, and here I'm going to say use the Poly retry policy. So I'm going to say wait and retry policy. So wait and retry async, and I'm going to do okay. So what's going on here is I'm saying that try the wait and retry async policy, and based on the number of array I'm going to give, it's going to retry that many times with whatever time span I specify. So I'm saying try it for a second, 2 seconds, and 3 seconds. So once I do that, now I'm going to go back to my value controller, and I'm going to get rid of this and this. So much cleaner. And I'm going to again try the same function. So now you can see the call came in. It will go inside the HTTP client. It got the HTTP client. It's going to call the getAsync method, and it's going to retry 3 times. So you can see it tried 3 times because it waited at least like 6 seconds inside of this, and then now it'll give up. Now if I go back and instead of this, if I say here, if I say 5 and if I say 15, you can see it's going to take a significant amount of time in the getAsync method itself, because internally it is retrying. Since this is the add transient error policy is bound with the HTTP client factory itself, the entire poly implementation of retry is handled inside of the get method itself, and it does not even come outside, which is essentially the beauty of using poly, that the code looks exactly same as you would write a normal getAsync method without any retry. So that's the beauty of it. So I'm going to run again, and we'll see that the getAsync will take close to 16-17 seconds to finish, whereas when first time we were trying, it was coming back almost immediately with an error when we were doing for each and retry, because we were taking the sleep outside of this call. So now go here and we'll see that it'll take at least like 16-17 seconds. So you can see it took around 17 seconds to come back, and then it will fail at this point. So that's the beauty of poly integration, and that is what I wanted to show you today. I think it's really awesome to be able to completely delegate the work during the service configuration itself, in the IOC container configuration itself, and let the application be completely transparent of the retry happening. And the fact that the HTTP client itself encapsulates the retry inside of get and post and all this method, it's really cool. So that's it. That's all I had for today. In my next video, I am going to continue using poly with some other feature like circuit breakers, and explore some of the features which are really helpful when you are building a distributed system or with a lot of single responsibility services which are talking to each other. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you want me to do something else with respect to the video, if you have any suggestion in the sound quality or the font or anything that I'm doing here, please leave me a comment so that I can make it better next time. Thank you so much for watching.